Oh, well, hello everyone. Super excited to be here with all you guys today on our third week of our 10 Commandments series. Now, I don't know about you, but I love sleep. I wish I could sleep all the time. Okay, maybe not all the time, but whenever I want to. But unfortunately, it doesn't always work like that. And sleep is important for our physical and even our mental rest, but it's also necessary for recovery and development. Studies show that teenagers need 8 to 10 hours of sleep a night. Are you getting that much? I know maybe I'm not getting that much every night, but if we physically need that much rest, how much do you think that we spiritually need for rest? Think about it, 8 to 10 hours a day is a lot, and maybe that's unrealistic, but my hope for you at the end of this video is that maybe it'll actually change your perspective on what Sabbath really is and what rest means to us. We first see a regular rhythmic time of rest right in the very beginning of the Bible. Before humans turned away from God, before God established his partnership with the nation of Israel, we see a pattern of resting on the seventh day that was established by God, seen in Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3. And we call this seventh day rest Sabbath. It reads this: By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing, so on the seventh day he rested from all of his work. And then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all of the work creating that he had done. And so maybe you're asking yourself, when does observing the Sabbath, what does it really mean? Was it only for people just back then, for God's people? Are Christians today supposed to observe the Sabbath? And if so, how are we supposed to do that? Why do we need to keep the commandments to remember the Sabbath if we don't live by some of the other commandments we see in the Bible, or some of the laws in the Bible, like the ones we read in Leviticus about mixing fabrics or eating unclean animals? Defining Sabbath in the Bible is important. But before we answer that question, let's take a look at the idea of Sabbath in the Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament. You see, there's two main Hebrew words that were used in the Bible for rest. I won't go into specifics of what that all is, but essentially one word means to stop working, where think of it like clocking out of a job or a shift, and the other word means to dwell or settle. And this is not the same as clocking out from an hourly job. This type of rest is like sitting in front of a fire with a warm drink or unpacking a suitcase when you're about to stay at your grandma's house for the holidays. And God also introduces both these two definitions right around the same time in Scripture. In the creation account, God works for 6 days creating the world, and then he rests on the seventh. After 6 days of bringing order to chaos, he takes the time to stop from his work. Only a few verses later, we read that God creates humans and then immediately rests them or settles them in the garden with him. The literary structure communicates a link between the concepts of these two types of rest. They are connected though. God leads by example as he rests from work, and then he dwells with his people. These opening chapters of Genesis communicate the importance of rest to God, but how will these concepts develop throughout the rest of the biblical story? You see, as we keep reading, we see the nation of Israel constantly reject God's design for rest repeatedly. We see that in Ezekiel 20, we see it in Jeremiah 17. They worship false gods, they ignore his instructions, and they rebel in almost every way possible. But despite this, God finds a way to rest or dwell his presence with them through the sacrificial system in the tabernacle and then later in the temple. The temple is modeled after the Garden of Eden, the place where God and humans rested together right from the start. Relational trust has always been at the heart of God's Sabbath invitation, but Israel struggled to receive it. As we finish reading the Hebrew scriptures, we're left wondering, will Sabbath rest ever be received the way that God actually intended? So let's jump a little bit ahead and find out. So how did Jesus keep the Sabbath day holy? We see the clearest picture of God's presence here on earth in the life of Jesus. Jesus was God coming to live amongst his people, and Jesus had a lot to say about the Sabbath and the true rest that God intends for us in humanity. In his gospel, Matthew includes a series of connected stories where Jesus is confronted by Israel's religious leaders and teachers. On the Sabbath day, the leaders object to Jesus' friends picking corn as they're walking through a field. We read that in Matthew 12. They also object to Jesus healing a man's shriveled hand in Matthew 12, 9-14, saying that Jesus is ignoring the command to keep the Sabbath found in the Hebrew scriptures. Jesus responds with an argument that clarifies the true definition of the Sabbath, asserting his role as the promised Messiah and pointing to his divinity. Jesus understood what the heart of Sabbath was, what God's original command was pointing to. To understand Jesus' point, we actually have to look at the context in which Matthew placed those stories. Sabbath in the New Testament talks about in Matthew that he records that these controversies were immediately after quoting Jesus' words about rest. In Matthew 11:28-29, we read this. Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." All this talk of rest right before a passage that deals with Sabbath, that is no mistake. The people have become weary and burdened by the heavy weight of observing the Sabbath, following the letter of the law while missing God's original intent behind the command. Jesus wants to clarify the meaning of Sabbath for them. The people are in need of rest, to stop hard work and to be present with God. And Jesus is here to usher in the full promise. He is God's rest, and the people can come to him and find the true seventh-day rest that God actually intended. Jesus reminds the people of God's original intention for the Sabbath, unity with God, creation, and each other. Jesus teaches that the Sabbath points to him, the one in the Israel's prophets promised would come to mercifully restore them the rhythm of all creation. When followers of Jesus observe the Sabbath, we live in this restoration has already taken place. We take a break from the broken rhythms of hustle and hardship and set aside a time to honor Jesus' rule, enjoy his presence, and extend rest to the world around us. When we trust God's invitation to come to him and truly rest, we become places where his presence can dwell. Observing the Sabbath for modern Christians, this is what it looks like. So does that practice the same for us today that we read about in the Bible for modern followers of Jesus? Does it mean attending a weekly church service, turning off your phone here and there, or maybe even just volunteering in your community? Does it matter what day you even observe the Sabbath? Sabbath could certainly include those activities, but the whole of the biblical story to emphasize the purpose of Sabbath rather than specific rules for observing it. As followers of Jesus, God doesn't expect us to live by Israel's laws. However, the wisdom of those laws still remain, and the law of the Sabbath is rich with significance for us here today. Sabbath is not a commandment we are bound to. It's a promise that we're invited to enjoy. Sabbath rest is an invitation to practice for eternity in God's presence. It's an act of regular and intentional trust of God's rule here on earth. We rest in order to dwell. When we stop working, we can truly rest in God's presence. When we practice this, we make room for God to take up residence in our individual lives and our communities. And when we do this, we take part in the new creation story, setting the stage for God to make his dwelling place once again here on earth. So maybe for you, you need to find some time to rest from your job or work or your phone or maybe something that brings you any form of stress. I encourage you today to take time not only to stop working, but to intentionally take some time to dwell in the presence of God. That could look like maybe listening to worship music, reading his word, going out for a walk in nature, speaking to him. And because Jesus is the new source of our rest, you can look to him to find that rest. Remember what Jesus invites us to do, and these are his words that I'll leave you with here today. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Hope you guys have a great week. Now's the time we're going to get into our small group discussions to learn more about what Sabbath and rest means for our own lives.